that somewhere along the line we decided not to take care of folks, and that was okay, and that it was more important to redirect housing into people that wanted to buy second homes as opposed to people that really needed this type of affordable housing. So again, when you have a situation where even working full-time at minimum wage, you can't afford housing, and you create a situation where people are unable to afford housing, normally before these cuts were made, they would have this $45 billion going into subsidies helping them out. After the cuts were made, that money became available only for people, in very privileged spaces. So the money just became switched. It never became unavailable. Our priorities just shifted from the populations that needed it to populations that, in my opinion, don't need it.
I think there's also a great deal of corruption in the housing market, as well as and of course we know there's a lot of corruption in the home mortgage scandal that's going on right now, and that's going to create a lot of homeless people, no doubt. So the homeless population will increase. My own theory about it is that homelessness is to housing what unemployment is to employment.
Right.
The
Newsom administration seems to think that the reason for homelessness is a lack of citations, and that's obviously not the case. They can give out as many citations and punish as many people as they want, but that doesn't get people housed. They can kick people out of certain shelters to set up situations where maybe 50 people that the hot team takes from the park can actually get shelter for a night or two, and then they're back out on the streets. Housing is going to solve homelessness, not criminalization. And one point I wanted to get back to, you asked me earlier how these citations function to make it harder for people to get off the streets. I don't think people realize that often people can't pay these citations, obviously, because they're living through poverty at the moment. And oftentimes it's very difficult to navigate the criminal justice system. So when the citation goes to a warrant, people actually become incarcerated. They get kicked off waiting lists they've been on for years to get housing, and they're actually kicked off their disability benefits also. So this whole process has made it almost impossible for people to pick themselves up out of poverty or to access services that are being kept from them so that they can have a stable environment to live in.
Exactly, and what I really meant when I said what unemployment is to employment, homelessness is to housing. For example, the financiers and investors and the money markets get really upset when employment dips to under 4%. They don't like they don't want full employment because obviously they won't have any scab labor, and workers would demand higher wages, etc. With homelessness, it's a case of homelessness keeps the housing market high, the rent's inflated, and as an old organizer, I know that there is no such thing as a rent strike anymore. People don't even talk about I can't think of the phrase myself for dilapidated housing. We used to have fights about inadequate housing, unfit for the shelter of human beings, but you don't hear talk about housing that is, slum housing, housing that is completely dilapidated. People are not fighting for improvements in housing. They're not fighting the landlords. They're not fighting the slumlords. You don't hear any of that. You don't hear rent strikes, rent protests, or anything because people are terrified that if they fight, they'll wind up in the street. If they argue about how high the rents are, they'll wind up back in the streets. So I think that that's one of the reasons, at least. But the other reason, of course, is the move toward privatization and the complete elimination of any social safety net.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the biggest fights at the right now is at the Coalition on Homelessness is to try and get standards, basic standards in the shelters. Right now, there's absolutely none, and we're also working on creating to actually get communities to think about housing in different ways, to really get people to articulate their needs in housing. It's assumed that if you're offered inadequate housing or an inadequate shelter, that's enough, and that as a poor person, for some reason, that those crumbs barely falling on us and often providing dangerous situations, that if we don't accept those things, then we're being ungrateful, or we're not being worthy, or we're not acting human. And I think part of this criminalization really leads to demoralization of who you are as a person. And it's hard enough being poor. It's hard enough having to live out on the streets and having to do the things you love to do in a safe environment, out and somewhere out in the cold. And that process is very demoralizing, and it's very difficult. But we've done a lot of outreach to the communities. We're bringing communities in for discussions, for meetings, for assemblies, for community events, and I really do feel the tide is changing, and I do see energy and people ready to work together and ready to fight their landlords and ready to have these standards and ready to put their energies towards the things that they know that they deserve, that for too long have been taken away from them, and really with the applaud of the public almost.
Yeah, we do have to organize and rise up against this monster housing situation. It's just it's inhumane, and it's dangerous. It's very deadly. How many homeless people? I mean, I used to get the statistics from the former director of the coalition, Paul Bowden, when I was doing Freedom on KPFA on radio, and he used to give me the stats every year of how many people had died on the streets. And I remember when I was working for KPU, I interviewed him several years back, and he said the previous year had been something like 160 people had died on the streets of San Francisco, and I was anticipating probably closer to 200 because it seemed to be rising like every year, about 20 more. And he said they're not providing those statistics at all anymore. They're not even counting the number who die on the streets, either from hypothermia or from being attacked. And so what is that situation? How do you know how many people are dying on the streets today?
Unfortunately, that number is very difficult to get. Community estimates run at almost over 100 people have died without a home over the past year. The memorial for folks that have died homeless is going to be on December 20th, but that information is not provided anymore by the mayor's office. We also know that hate crimes against poor folks are on the rise. We've been in contact and having meetings with service providers in the community, and they're reporting that hate crimes against poor folks has just skyrocketed. There's been a lot of anti-poor media coming out, especially from the Chronicle. And this has just created a situation where people feel like it's okay and condoned by the public, by the government, by the media, that poor people are to be hated and to be criminalized, and they're criminals. And
you know what's really cold about that too is the fact that veterans